There are moments in life that seem ordinary from the outside. A phone call, a signature on a piece of paper, a single word spoken in the wrong direction at the wrong time. But sometimes, one decision, just one, carries the weight of everything that comes after it. And once it is made, the world it leaves behind is unrecognizable from the world that existed before. This is one of those stories. This is the story of a decision that did not just change a life, it ended one entirely and nearly swallowed everyone connected to it into the same darkness. By the time the truth surfaced, it was already too late for several people who deserved far better. And the most haunting part is not what happened, it is how easily it could have gone another way. The year was 1986, and the Space Shuttle Challenger was scheduled to launch from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. NASA had built its reputation on precision, on science, on the kind of institutional confidence that comes from putting men on the moon and bringing them back alive. The agency was the gold standard of human achievement. It was the place where the word impossible went to be disproven. And on the morning of January 28th, it was also the place where one of the most preventable disasters in modern history quietly assembled itself, piece by piece, into an inevitable catastrophe. 7 people climbed aboard that shuttle. 7 human beings, with families, with futures, with breakfast that morning and conversations the night before, and plans for what they would do when they got home. None of them knew they were walking into the last moments of their lives. None of them had any reason to think that the machinery of failure had already been set in motion, not in the shuttle itself, but in the meeting rooms and phone lines of the days and nights before launch. The crew of Challenger mission STS-51-L was not a random collection of astronauts. They were extraordinary people. Commander Francis Scobie was a decorated Air Force pilot who had spent years preparing for exactly this mission. Pilot Michael Smith was equally accomplished, a Navy test pilot with thousands of flight hours behind him. Judith Resnick was a brilliant electrical engineer and only the second American woman to fly in space. Ellison Onizuka was the first person of Asian descent to reach space, a man from Hawaii who had dreamed of the stars since childhood. Ronald McNair was a physicist and accomplished saxophonist who had already flown once before and was eager to return to orbit. Gregory Jarvis was a satellite payload specialist whose quiet work behind the scenes made the mission possible. And then there was Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, selected from more than 11,000 applicants to be the first ordinary American citizen to fly in space. She had planned to teach lessons from orbit, to look down at the Earth through the windows of Challenger and bring that experience back to every classroom in the country. She had students watching. She had a country watching. She had 2 children and a husband watching from Cape Canaveral that morning, standing in the cold January air, proud and nervous and full of hope. The night before the launch, something was already breaking apart. Not the shuttle, not the hardware, at least not yet. What was breaking apart was a conversation. A decision was being made, or more precisely, a decision was being unmade, and the people with the knowledge to stop it were being pushed aside by the people with the power to ignore it. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for manufacturing the solid rocket boosters that would propel Challenger into the sky, had grown increasingly alarmed about the O-rings. These were rubber seals, deceptively simple components that sat at the joints of the rocket boosters and were responsible for containing the hot gases produced during launch. Without intact O-rings, those gases could escape, and if they escaped in the wrong direction, the consequences would be catastrophic. The engineers had been worried about O-ring performance in cold temperatures for months. There was data, there were charts, there were clear and documented concerns that the rubber seals did not perform reliably when the temperature dropped below a certain threshold. The temperature forecast for the morning of January 28th was brutal. Overnight temperatures near Cape Canaveral had fallen to around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice had formed on the launch structure itself. NASA technicians photographed it. The cold was not subtle. It was everywhere, and it was exactly the kind of condition that the Thiokol engineers had warned about. On the evening before the launch, those engineers held an emergency teleconference with NASA managers to present their concerns. Roger Boisjoly, one of the lead engineers, laid out the data clearly and urgently. He had been raising alarms about the O-rings for nearly a year. He had written internal memos. He had requested launch delays. He had done everything that a responsible engineer with a conscience and a clear understanding of the risk is supposed to do. And in that teleconference, he did it again. He showed charts. He explained that the data was not ambiguous. He said in plain language that launching in cold conditions was dangerous. He said they should not fly. What happened next is the part of this story that does not let go. NASA managers pushed back. They expressed frustration with the recommendation not to launch. There was pressure, real and palpable pressure, rooted in a schedule that had already been delayed multiple times, rooted in a media cycle that had grown impatient, rooted in the upcoming State of the Union address that President Reagan had reportedly planned to reference the mission in. Whether or not that political detail directly influenced the decision is something historians still debate. What is not debated is the atmosphere in that teleconference room. One NASA manager asked the Thiokol engineers to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. That phrase has echoed through decades of aerospace history ever since. It was an invitation to stop thinking like scientists and start thinking like people who needed a launch to happen. And in a move that Roger Boisjoly would describe as the worst moment of his professional life, the Thiokol management overruled their own engineers and recommended launch approval. The engineers who had tried to stop it were not in the room when the final decision was made. Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson were physically escorted out before the managers voted. The people who understood the risk most deeply were the ones given the least say at the most critical moment. One manager, Bob Lund, had initially sided with the engineers. He changed his vote after being pressured by a superior to reconsider. The approval was given. The launch was authorized, and the men and women who would pay the price for that decision had no idea it had been made. January 28, 1986. The morning was cold and bright and full of the particular kind of American hope that gathers at a rocket launch. Families were there. Cameras were there. Krista McCullough's students had gathered in front of televisions across the country. Mission Control was watching. The world was watching. At 11:38 in the morning, the engines ignited, and Challenger arose from the launch pad with the full, terrible beauty of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. For 73 seconds, everything appeared normal. 73 seconds. That's just over a minute. Long enough to take a breath, long enough to feel a wash of relief that the cold night had not mattered, that the engineers had been wrong, that the pressure to launch had been the right call after all. But the O-ring on the right solid rocket booster had already failed at the moment of ignition. Soot, detected later in the investigation footage and data, had leaked through almost immediately. For 73 seconds, a small flame burned through the side of the booster, like a torch being held against the skin of the shuttle. And then, at 73 seconds, the external fuel tank ruptured. The vehicle broke apart at an altitude of approximately 46,000 feet, traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound. The explosion that followed was technically not a detonation. The shuttle did not simply blow up in one sudden fireball. It disintegrated. The cabin crew separated intact from the rest of the vehicle and continued upward briefly before beginning its fall toward the Atlantic Ocean. There is evidence, haunting and terrible, that some of the crew members survived the initial breakup. Personal emergency air packs belonging to 3 of the crew were found activated, which means someone had presence of mind and consciousness in those final moments. The cabin fell for nearly 3 minutes before it struck the ocean at over 200 miles per hour. No one survived. The images of the aftermath played on every television in America and around the world. The white exhaust trail in the blue January sky, forking into 2 arcing lines, became one of the defining images of the 1980s. Krista McCullough's parents had been watching from the viewing area at Kennedy Space Center. Her students had been watching from their classroom. The country watched in silence, then in grief, then in the particular kind of confusion that comes when something that was supposed to be safe and triumphant becomes something else entirely. President Reagan postponed the State of the Union address. He delivered instead a brief and genuinely moving statement written by Peggy Noonan, borrowing a line from the poem High Flight, saying that the crew had slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. In the weeks and months that followed, the investigation began to pick apart what had happened. The Rogers Commission, led by former Secretary of State Roger Rogers and including physicist Richard Feynman and former astronaut Sally Ride, examined the wreckage, reviewed the communications, and uncovered the full story of that teleconference, those O-rings, and the decision made the night before launch. Feynman conducted a now legendary demonstration during the hearings, dropping a piece of O-ring material into a glass of ice water during live testimony to show the committee how cold temperatures affected its resilience. The rubber barely recovered its shape. The physics was undeniable. The failure was not a mystery. It had been predicted.